Imagine waking up tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And you just discover that your country has essentially time traveled backward by 30 years.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It really is. I mean, the hospitals in your city are suddenly operating with the resources of like 1993. The national economy has shrunk by nearly 75%.
Yeah, your children's schools are just emptying out.
Exactly. And yet, ironically, amidst all of this chaos, your nation's carbon footprint has become the absolute envy of the global climate community.
It's a completely mind-bending scenario.
Sounds like science fiction, right? But it's not.
No, it's not. It is a very harsh, very documented mathematical reality.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we are taking a magnifying glass to the anatomical breakdown of a modern nation.
We have an incredibly detailed, massive data set from the United Nations right in front of us.
We do. It's a presentation titled The Tragedy of Development, and it spans from 1990 all the way to 2023.
And we are going to be looking at a whole spectrum of global metrics.
Right, like the Human Development Index, gender inequality data, economic output, and even planetary environmental pressures.
Our mission today is to understand a terrifying but captivating phenomenon.
Exactly. We are looking at a country's reverse evolution. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
While the rest of the world has basically spent the 21st century on a steady march forward, curing diseases, expanding digital access, lifting entire regions out of poverty.
Right, a general upward trend.
Yeah. But one of South America's formerly richest nations, Venezuela, essentially shifted into reverse and stepped on the gas.
It's an anomaly that completely shatters our basic assumptions about how human progress actually works.
It really does. But before we jump into the mechanics of this, I know you wanted to establish some ground rules for the listener.
Yes, I do. Because before we delve into the numbers, I need to set a very clear framework for you, the listener.
Go for it.
The data set we are analyzing today touches on historically layered, deeply complex, and often very painful events for millions of people.
Right. Real human lives.
Exactly. But our mission today is strictly, unapologetically analytical. We are not here to take political sides.
No.
We are not here to litigate left-wing or right-wing ideologies, and we are absolutely not here to point fingers at specific administrations, whether local or international.
So we're just looking at the math.
Purely the math. Our job today is to act purely as forensic data scientists. We are looking at the trend lines, the mathematics, and the socioeconomic mechanisms.
The things that explain how a nation's development engine can simply stall and fail.
Precisely.
I'm really glad you set those ground rules. I mean, we're basically looking at the blueprints of a collapsed building to understand why the steel gave way, not to argue about who painted the walls.
That is a perfect analogy.
So to really grasp the magnitude of what happened here, I think we need to understand what normal looks like.
Right, the baseline.
Yeah. If progress is a machine, what does it sound like when it's running smoothly?
That is the perfect place to start. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the global baseline over the last 3 decades is actually a story of remarkable, quiet triumph.
Quiet triumph. I like that.
The United Nations measures this using something called the Human Development Index, or HDI.
Right. And for anyone listening who might not, look at UN data every day, HDI isn't just about how much money a country has, is it?
Exactly. GDP, or gross domestic product, that just tells you the size of the cash register.
Okay.
The HDI was created to measure actual human well-being. It's a composite of 3 things.
Which are?
Life expectancy, so how long and healthy your life is. Education, meaning how many years of schooling you get. And per capita income, which is your standard of living.
And it's scored on a scale, right?
Yes, it's a score from 0 to 1. From 1990 to 2023, the global average HDI climbed steadily from 0.60 to 0.756.
So a 0.15 increase. I mean, that might sound tiny to someone listening, just a fraction of a
And
decimal.
it does sound small on paper.
Yeah. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Yeah. It looks like billions of invisible miracles.
Wow.
It means a village in Southeast Asia gets a paved road so farmers can sell their crops before they rot.
Right.
It means a clinic in sub-Saharan Africa gets a solar fridge to keep vaccines cold. It means girls who would have been pulled out of school at age 10 are now graduating high school.
So it's real, tangible progress.
Exactly. When that global average moves from 0.60 to 0.756, you are watching the ambient condition of humanity slowly becoming safer, smarter, and more secure.
It's a slow, steady, reliable upward slope,
It is.
which makes the data for Venezuela look like an absolute glitch in the matrix.
It really does.
Because for a long time, they weren't just following that global trend, they were beating it.
They were. By 2013, Venezuela had reached an HDI of 0.773.
So they were comfortably above the global average at the time.
Yes, they were in the upper middle tier of human development worldwide.
But then, I'm looking at the slide here, the data from 2013 onward. The line on the graph just breaks.
It's a sheer drop.
It plummets. It drops off a cliff, hitting a valley of 0.696 around 2021.
And there is a microscopic, almost negligible bounce to 0.709 in 2023.
But the damage is already done. It's staggering. It's like an airplane cruising at 30,000 feet and suddenly the engines just detach from the wings.
The altitude drop is severe. Let's look at the global rankings to put that in perspective for a second.
Okay, let's do it.
In a list of every country on Earth, back in 1993, Venezuela was ranked 58th.
Okay, 58th, not bad.
Not bad at all, but by 2023, they had fallen to 127th.
Dropping 69 places.
A drop of 69 places in the global hierarchy of human development.
That's just, wow.
It is an almost unprecedented freefall in modern peacetime data.
Okay, I want to pause here. Because a ranking drop of 69 places, if my favorite sports team drops in the standings, it just means they lose out on the playoffs.
Right, it's just a game.
Yeah, the numbers on a spreadsheet change. But what does dropping 69 places actually mean for the daily, lived reality of a citizen on the ground?
It means the entire coordinate system of your life has been rewritten.
How so?
Imagine the expectations you grew up with. You expected that if you worked hard, your paycheck would cover your groceries.
Sure, the basic social contract.
Exactly. You expected that if you called an ambulance, it would have gasoline, it would arrive, and the hospital would have power.
Right.
You expected the local school to have teachers. Dropping 69 places means waking up to find that the basic infrastructure of your society has evaporated.
So your new peers are totally different.
Yes. Your new peer nations, the countries you are now tied with in the rankings, have entirely different, much lower historical baselines of survival.
That has to be a profound psychological shock.
It is. You are living in the same physical house, but the foundation has turned to sand.
And that physical foundation turning to sand, it has to start somewhere.
It always has a trigger.
There has to be a physical trigger for an entire nation to lose its footing so violently. I want to transition to what the data suggests is the absolute core engine of this collapse.
The economic data.
Yes. Because there is a number in this data set that honestly made me rub my eyes. I'm talking about the gross national income, the GNI per capita.
The GNI data is the tectonic plate shifting. Everything else is just the earthquake that follows.
So help me understand the scale of this. The data shows that around the 2008 to 2012 window, Venezuela's GNI per capita hit a historical peak.
It was over $22,000.
Right, specifically around $22,169. But by 2020, that number had collapsed to just $5,990.
Yes.
Here's what gets really interesting. We are talking about a 73% evaporation of national wealth.
73%, yes.
How does an entire nation lose 73% of its wealth? I understand a recession, right?
Sure, my market dip.
A stock market crashes.
Yeah.
Unemployment spikes to 10%. Maybe GDP drops a few points, but 73%.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
Did the physical money catch on fire?
Yeah.
What is the actual mechanism of wealth destruction at that scale?
It's a fantastic question. And to understand it, we need to think about national wealth not as a pile of gold in a vault, but as a water reservoir.
Okay, a reservoir. I'm tracking.
Gross national income is the water pressure that keeps the entire municipal plumbing system working.
Right.
In a highly globalized economy, a nation relies on a constant flow of income, usually from exports, to generate the foreign currency needed to buy things from the rest of the world.
Right, because you can't just print your own local money and send it to, say, a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland to buy antibiotics.
No, they want dollars or euros.
Exactly.
Precisely. Now, imagine a country where the vast majority of that income comes from a single source.
A single pipe filling the reservoir.
Exactly. If the price of that export crashes globally, or if the internal machinery producing that export breaks down due to lack of maintenance and investment,
The flow of dollars just stops.
the flow stops, the reservoir begins to drain.
So the government suddenly has no foreign currency.
Right. And when a government has massive internal expenses, public salaries, subsidized food programs, infrastructure projects,
But its actual revenue has dried up.
yes, it faces a lethal choice. It can either enact brutal austerity, firing millions of people and stopping
So it
services,
usually leads to immediate riots, right?
almost always, or it can try to cheat the math.
How do you cheat the math?
It turns on the printing presses. It prints millions of units of local currency to pay the domestic bills, hoping to keep the plumbing flowing.
But there's no value there.
Exactly. Because there is no actual economic value backing that new paper, the currency hyperinflates.
And here's where the lived reality gets terrifying.
It does.
Can you explain how hyperinflation actually feels to a citizen? Because if I have $10,000 in my savings account and the government prints a bunch of money, I still have $10,000, right?
You do. The number on your bank statement hasn't changed, but hyperinflation acts like a chemical solvent on the purchasing power of that money.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say today, a loaf of bread costs 1 unit of your currency. Tomorrow, the government doubles the money supply.
Right.
Suddenly, the baker needs 2 units for that same bread because the flour importer needs more money because the currency is worth less globally.
It just spirals.
A week later, it costs 10 units. A month later, 1,000 units.
So your life savings.
Your life savings, which could have bought a house a year ago, can now barely buy a carton of eggs.
Oh, wow.
The 73% drop in GNI isn't just a macroeconomic statistic. It is the absolute vaporization of personal purchasing power.
People are going to work.
Working an 8-hour shift.
Mm.
And the salary they earn for that day cannot purchase enough calories to replace the energy they burned walking to the factory.
That is just bleak.
Aha.
If I imagine my own household budget permanently shrinking by 75%,
It's like an impossible situation.
I wouldn't just be cutting back on streaming services. I would be making impossible choices immediately.
Food or medicine.
Exactly. Do I buy dinner tonight or do I buy the blood pressure medication? Do we keep the electricity on or do we buy shoes for the kids?
And when a nation of millions is forced into that impossible calculus, the first thing that breaks isn't the bank.
What breaks?
It is the human body. Which brings us to the health data.
This is where the numbers turn from economic theory to pure tragedy.
We really do.
If the economic reservoir is dry, the survival baselines retreat. Let's look at the life expectancy data.
Let's look at it.
In 2011, the expected lifespan reached a high of 73.09 years. By 2021, it rolled back to 71.53 years.
A drop of over a year and a half.
Right. Now, a year and a half might not sound like a huge drop to a casual observer,
Right.
but statistically, how rare is a reversal like this?
In the modern era, it is an absolute siren.
A siren.
Yes. Global life expectancy is almost universally a one-way street pointing up.
Because of medical advancements?
Exactly. We have better sanitation, we understand germ theory, we have all global supply chains for basic antibiotics.
So it should go down.
To see a non-natural drop in national life expectancy, meaning a drop that wasn't caused by a sudden catastrophic event like a massive tsunami or a localized war,
Right.
it is the loudest alarm bell of systemic societal failure.
Because it means the ambient, everyday environment has become lethal.
Exactly. It means chronic diseases that were perfectly manageable are suddenly fatal.
Quite.
A diabetic patient who lived a normal life in 2010 suddenly cannot find insulin in 2016, and they pass away at age 45.
Oh, man.
A simple bacterial infection from a scraped knee becomes sepsis because the local clinic has no penicillin.
And the data points to a specific metric that highlights just how completely the medical net disintegrated.
The maternal mortality data?
Yes, the maternal mortality ratio, or MMR. The numbers here are honestly difficult to say out loud.
And they are grim.
In 1990, it was around 92 deaths per 100,000 live births. By 2015, as the crisis accelerated, it hit 125.7.
Which is already a huge jump.
But then, in the 2020 to 2023 period, it skyrocketed to a sustained 259.1.
It essentially doubled from its already elevated state.
Why is maternal mortality specifically such a crucial indicator for data scientists here? Why does this specific data point explode by over 100% when overall life expectancy only dropped by a year and a half?
This raises an important question about how we measure the structural integrity of a state.
Okay.
MMR is the ultimate stress test of a healthcare system.
Why is that?
Because delivering a baby safely is not a single medical act. It is a highly complex logistical chain.
Okay, walk me through that chain.
Yeah.
What does a hospital actually need to function for a maternity ward?
First, you need preventative care. Months of prenatal visits to monitor blood pressure, check for preeclampsia, and ensure the mother is nourished.
Right, catching problems early,
Then, when labor begins, you need a facility with guaranteed uninterrupted electricity.
which you need a good grid for.
You need sterile water. You need an autoclave to sterilize surgical instruments in case an emergency C-section is required.
And if the power grid is failing,
If the national power grid is suffering from rolling blackouts because the government couldn't afford to maintain the turbines at the hydroelectric dam,
the hospital goes dark.
the hospital goes dark, the backup generators might kick in, assuming the hospital could afford to buy diesel fuel, which is now scarce.
And if they don't?
If the generators fail, the incubators in the neonatal ward shut off, the surgical theaters lose light.
That is terrifying. And what about supplies?
That's the final link in the chain. Giving birth involves a massive risk of hemorrhage.
Right?
A functioning hospital requires an active, well-stocked blood bank, which requires constant refrigeration.
Which goes back to the power issue.
Exactly. It also requires a deep supply of IV fluids, oxytocin to stop bleeding, and broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent postpartum infection.
And because of the economic collapse.
When a country's GNI drops by 73% and it loses access to foreign currency, it cannot import those antibiotics or those IV bags. The supply chain breaks.
So when the MMR doubles to 259, it's not just a medical statistic.
No, not at all.
It is the mathematical proof that the hospital has basically become just a building.
Precisely. It proves the medical safety net has completely disintegrated.
Wow.
Women are suddenly bearing a disproportionate, terrifying risk of death simply to bring life into the world.
Because the state can no longer provide the basic logistical environment for modern medicine to exist.
That's exactly it.
It is the ultimate failure to protect the most vulnerable at their most vulnerable moment.
It is.
So the health system is collapsing under the weight of the economic stall.
Yes.
What happens to the mind? What happens to the future of the country? I want to shift our focus to the buffer and the squeeze.
The education and labor data.
Specifically, the data on education and the labor force, yeah.
Education data in a crisis often reveals what economists call delayed resilience.
Delayed resilience.
Yes, it is a fascinating, if tragic, lagging indicator.
I was actually really confused when I first looked at this section of the data set.
Why is that?
Because we have two different metrics for education, and they seem to be telling completely opposite stories.
The expected versus the mean.
Right. We have expected years of schooling, which is what a child entering the system today is projected to receive.
Correct.
And we have mean years of schooling, which is the average education the adult population already possesses.
So what did the numbers show?
The expected years of schooling dropped from a peak of 14.1 years in 2009 down to 12.9 years in 2023.
Which makes sense. The country is in crisis.
Right. Schooling
Yes.
drops. But the mean years of schooling for adults actually crept up.
It did?
It went from 5.34 years back in 1990 and slowly climbed to 9.67 years by 2023, where it just stagnated.
So you're wondering how average education goes up while the system is collapsing.
Exactly. How does that work?
What's fascinating here is the structural difference between a locked-in asset and a future flow.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Think of education as a bank account. The adults already made their deposits. That is the mean years of schooling.
So the education they already got.
Right. The adults in 2023 are the people who went to high school and university in the late 1990s and 2000s, when the oil was flowing, the GNI was high, and the state was heavily subsidizing universities.
Oh, I see.
They have their degrees. That knowledge can't be taken away by inflation.
So it's a snapshot of the past.
Exactly. It shows delayed resilience. But the expected years of schooling, that is the flow of new deposits for the next generation.
And that flow is bleeding out.
It is bleeding out rapidly.
Why exactly does a child's expected schooling drop? Is it just that the government stops building schools?
It's much more insidious than that. The school building might still be there.
But no one's inside.
Remember the hyperinflation we discussed? Imagine you are a public school teacher.
Okay.
Your salary is paid in local currency. Suddenly, your monthly paycheck is only enough to buy a single bag of rice. What do?
I mean, I can't go to work. I have to figure out how to feed my own family. I have to find a side hustle or leave the country entirely.
Exactly. The phenomenon of brain drain kicks in. Teachers, professors, administrators, they abandon their posts to survive.
So the school has no teachers
Simultaneously, the children themselves are pulled out of the classroom.
because they have to work.
If a family's purchasing power drops by 75%, A teenager can't sit in a classroom learning algebra.
Right, they need to help out.
They need to be standing in line at a subsidized food market or trying to earn cash in the informal economy.
So it's a silent loss.
Very silent.
The buildings are there, the adults have their old degrees, but the future human capital of the nation is just evaporating into thin air.
And that loss of human capital will handicap the country's recovery for decades, long after the inflation is eventually tamed.
Because you can't just fix it overnight.
You cannot instantly print a generation of engineers and doctors.
Wow. That brings me to the adults in the present day, because the data reveals a massive hidden demographic squeeze.
The gender divide.
Yes, the economic storm destroyed incomes indiscriminately, but the Gender Development Index, the GDI, shows us a massive fracture.
Women absorbed a devastating blow.
They really did. If we look at the raw income numbers, the disparity is stark.
The numbers are quite revealing.
In 2010, the estimated female gross national income was roughly $13,836. By 2020, it had crashed to just $4,099.
A massive loss.
Now, male income crashed too, from over $27,000 down to roughly $7,900. Everyone suffered.
But the baselines were different.
Exactly. The women started with a lower baseline and were driven incredibly close to the absolute floor of survival.
And that income destruction is inextricably linked to the labor force participation rates.
Right, the dumbbell plot data.
Yes. The UN dataset includes a breakdown comparing the labor participation between 2002 and 2023.
The data shows female labor participation dropping from 54.7% down to 47.2%.
And male participation.
Male participation dropped as well from 83.6% to 71.7%.
Right, it's dropped.
Now, I want to pitch a hypothesis here, because this data completely contradicts what I thought I knew about macroeconomics.
Let's hear it.
Usually, historically, when a massive economic crisis hits, like the Great Depression or severe wartime rationing, don't we usually see secondary earners pushed into the workforce?
That is the typical model, yes.
In traditional family structures, if the primary earner's wages are destroyed by inflation or they lose their job, the partner who is perhaps staying home has to go find work just to buy bread.
To make ends meet.
Exactly. Why did labor participation shrink for everyone, and specifically, why were women pushed out of the workforce here?
It's a very logical hypothesis based on normal recession dynamics. But remember, this isn't a recession.
It's a collapse.
This is a systemic collapse. The answer lies in the total disintegration of the social safety nets.
How does that connect to going to work?
Think about the invisible infrastructure that allows any parent to hold a 9-to-5 job.
Okay.
When a society functions normally, it relies on a vast web of formal and informal care systems.
Like daycares and stuff?
Public schools act as daytime childcare. State-run clinics manage the elderly and the sick. Public transportation physically moves you to the office.
Oh, okay.
When the state runs out of money, those public services vanish. The school closes because the teacher left.
Right.
The local clinic shutters. The buses stop running because there are no imported spare parts for the engines.
So all that invisible infrastructure is gone.
But here is the critical part. The burden of care does not disappear.
The kids still exist.
The children still need to be watched. The sick grandparents still need to be fed.
So the care work is entirely privatized. It gets pushed back into the home.
Exactly. And in almost every society, when public infrastructure collapses, traditional gender roles harden.
The burden falls on the women.
The burden of unpaid, uncompensated care falls overwhelmingly on women. Without functioning schools or affordable elder care, women were forced to leave the formal labor market.
They didn't have a choice.
They were squeezed out of the economy entirely because the state stopped providing the hidden infrastructure that allowed them to work in the first place.
That is profound. It's like the floor fell out from under the men, but the women were handed an anchor as they fell.
That's a powerful way to put it.
They couldn't even try to swim in the formal economy because they were chained to the survival logistics of the household.
That is exactly the mechanism.
Now, in our role as purely objective forensic analysts, we have to look at the entire board.
We do.
And amidst all this devastation, there was one metric that was actually moving in a positive direction. I want to look at the data on political representation.
Yes, the data set tracks the share of parliamentary seats held by women.
And it actually rose significantly. Back in 1990, women held only 6.3% of the seats in parliament.
A very small fraction.
By 2023, that number had climbed to 22.1%.
So a noticeable increase.
So what does this actually mean in the context of everything we've just discussed? Is this the one shining beacon of progress? A silver lining?
Well, we must validate it as a structural win.
Okay.
Increasing the political representation of women from 6% to 22% is a mathematically undeniable improvement in inclusion.
Right, more voices at the table.
It means voices that were historically shut out of the legislative process are now in the room. However, as analysts, we have to apply a critical lens to this data point within its broader, brutal context.
Right, because what can those voices actually do?
That is the core question. Does political representation yield tangible, material improvement for the population when the economic survival pressure is so crushing?
Probably not much.
The policies that female parliamentarians might passionately champion increased maternal health funding, subsidies for early childhood education, nutritional support for single mothers,
They all cost money.
they all require a functioning economic reservoir to enact.
It's like finally winning a seat on the board of directors of a company, but the company is entirely bankrupt and the office is on fire.
Exactly. It's a structural win in a collapsing building. Without the gross national income to back up the legislation, political representation becomes tragically symbolic in the face of immediate material deprivation.
Because you can't legislate resources into existence.
You can pass a law guaranteeing maternal health care, but if there are no antibiotics in the country, the law is just ink on paper.
And that material deprivation brings us to a concept that I found completely fascinating.
The inequality adjustments.
Yes, the invisible tax or the hidden exploitation beneath the averages. We've been throwing around this HDI number, the Human Development Index, which was 0.709 in 2023.
Right, the average score.
But the UN dataset also calculates something called the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
It's a vital metric.
And when you apply the inequality filter, the number drops precipitously to 0.605.
The UN introduced the IHDI to solve a major flaw in how we perceive national data.
Because averages are inherently deceptive. Let me try out an analogy here.
Please do.
I used to think of averages like the old joke. If a billionaire and a homeless person are sitting in a room together, on average, they are both incredibly wealthy.
Which completely misrepresents the room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really capture a systemic collapse. Let's go back to your water reservoir analogy.
Okay, the national reservoir.
When the national reservoir drains by 73%, the remaining water doesn't just evaporate evenly from everyone's cup.
No, it certainly doesn't.
The people who control the valves, the political elites, the highly connected, the top economic tier, they still get their water.
Of course.
In fact, they might get bottled water delivered. They switch their assets to US dollars. They buy private diesel generators to keep their lights on.
If they get sick, they fly to a private clinic in another country.
Exactly. They completely insulate themselves from the collapse of the public state.
Meanwhile, the rest of the population,
The bottom tier, the vast majority of the population, is forced to rely on the dry pipes. They face a reality much, much harsher than that 0.709 average suggests.
the data bears that out with chilling precision. If we look at the waterfall chart in the presentation,
Yeah, the mathematical reality.
when you factor in the extreme disparities in how health, education, and income are distributed, you see a total developmental loss of 14.6% just from inequality.
It's a huge chunk.
And the most harrowing part of that specific data set,
No.
life expectancy inequality alone causes a 12.6% loss.
Meaning the gap between who gets to live a long life and who dies young is massively widening.
Yes. It highlights a fundamental truth of development economics. Systemic collapse is rarely an equal opportunity destroyer.
It hits the bottom hardest.
It actively exacerbates existing social fissures. The vulnerable absorb the kinetic impact of the crash so the insulated can maintain a semblance of their standard of living.
That is incredibly dark.
The IHDI of 0.605 is the true mathematical reflection of the street-level reality for the average citizen.
Which perfectly transitions us to what might be the most bizarre, darkly comedic finding in this entire UN dataset.
The environmental data?
Yes. We've looked at the HDI, we've looked at the inequality adjustment, but the UN also calculates a third metric, the PHDI.
The planetary pressures adjusted HDI.
Right. And the data here is just, it stopped me in my track.
It's very counterintuitive.
The data shows that Venezuela's per capita CO2 emissions plummeted from 6.59 tons in 2010 down to just 2.4 tons in 2020.
A massive reduction.
Furthermore, Their material footprint, which is the total amount of raw earth, minerals, and biomass extracted to meet consumption demands, was literally cut in half.
It dropped from 15.8 tons in 2015 to 7.9 tons in just 1 year, 2016.
The sheer velocity of that drop is staggering.
Yeah.
Any other country on Earth right now would be throwing a massive global parade for having their carbon and material footprint in a decade.
They would be the keynote speakers at every global climate summit.
Exactly. So what does this all mean?
Well, we know that context is everything in data analysis. If you only look at the environmental spreadsheet, it looks like a utopian green transition.
But it's not.
But this was not the result of brilliant ecological policy. They didn't install millions of solar panels. They didn't transition to a highly efficient, sustainable, circular economy with electric public transit.
Then what caused it?
This is a phenomenon we term passive emission reduction.
Passive emission reduction.
Mm-hmm.
That is an incredibly sterile, bureaucratic term for a very grim reality.
The grim truth is that this accidental greening was caused by the total paralysis of heavy industry and the absolute destruction of consumer purchasing power.
It's like curing a patient's raging fever by locking them inside a meat freezer.
That is a brutally accurate analogy.
Technically, you bring the core temperature down, the thermometer says you succeeded, but the patient is freezing to death.
Exactly. You stop emitting carbon when your cement factories go bankrupt and the smokestacks rust.
Right.
You stop burning fossil fuels when your power plants fail from lack of maintenance and the grid goes dark.
And your material footprint halves
Because your citizens are too poor to buy manufactured goods, new clothes, or appliances.
So the Earth benefits.
The Earth benefits, yes. The atmosphere receives less carbon, but the mechanism driving it is total economic death.
It is an incredibly dark paradox. You can't just look at the dropping carbon line and cheer. You have to ask why the smoke stopped coming out of the factory chimneys.
This brings us to the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive today.
Bringing it all together.
We've examined all these disparate, chaotic data points, from the evaporation of national wealth and the tragic spike in maternal mortality to the lagging education metrics and this accidental greening.
Right.
But they are not isolated phenomena. They form a single, terrifying mechanism of collapse.
Let's trace the dominoes falling, one by one. I want to paint a verbal picture of the system dynamics map from the presentation. How does the engine stall?
Domino 1 is the GNI avalanche, the 73% destruction of gross national income.
The reservoir drains.
The export revenue dries up, foreign currency vanishes, and hyperinflation destroys purchasing power. That is the initial kinetic impact.
Got it. What's next?
That triggers Domino 2, public expenditure paralysis. Without actual value flowing into the state coffers, the government cannot function.
Surfaces stop.
Infrastructure crumbles, the power grid fails. Imports of critical goods like medicine and machinery halt entirely.
Which directly strikes domino 3. Medical and educational collapse.
Yes.
The hospitals lose power and antibiotics, causing that massive 100% spike in maternal mortality.
And the schools.
The schools lose funding. Teachers flee the hyperinflation, causing the expected years of schooling to drop as the next generation bleeds human capital.
And finally, Domino 4. The squeeze.
The gender squeeze.
Because the public safety nets of school and healthcare have vanished, the burden of care is privatized into the home.
So vulnerable populations are hit hardest.
Specifically women who are pushed out of the formal economy to backfill the collapsed social services with unpaid labor. It is a perfect, devastating, closed-loop feedback cycle.
The UN data actually provides a summary dashboard of this lost decade, comparing the peak in 2013 to the reality of 2023. It is a stark, black and white snapshot.
The numbers speak for themselves.
Human Development Index, down from 0.773 to 0.709. Income per capita, down drastically from nearly $22,000 to just over $7,100.
Maternal deaths,
up drastically from 124 to 259 life expectancy. Down. It is a mathematical portrait of systemic tragedy.
It is.
But I think it's vital to remind the listener that behind the cold math of these UN metrics, behind every single decimal point and trend line, are millions of citizens whose daily lives, dreams, and basic survival were radically, violently upended.
That is the core thesis we must take away from this forensic analysis. The case of Venezuela shatters a very comforting illusion we hold in the modern developed world.
What illusion is that?
We tend to believe that human development is an inevitable unidirectional upward curve. We assume that once a society achieves a certain level of wealth, health, and technological integration, those gains are locked in permanently.
That they become the permanent floor.
Exactly. This data set proves that without deep economic foundations, without a diversified revenue engine, And without robust institutional resilience, societal progress is incredibly fragile
It can be unraveled with terrifying speed.
in just a single decade.
And that leads me to a lingering question I want to leave with you, the listener, to ponder today.
A final thought.
We spend so much time obsessing over how to push our own societies forward, right? We read articles on how to integrate the newest tech, how to achieve the fastest economic growth, how to get the best health care,
Always looking up.
always looking up. But looking at this data, looking at how fast the engine can stall and the altitude can drop, you have to ask yourself, how strong are the safety nets under your feet?
It's a sobering question.
If the main economic engine of your country stalled tomorrow, if the foreign currency dried up and the power grid began to stutter, how many years of progress would you lose in a single decade?
Would it hold?
Are we actually building resilient, structurally sound societies, or are we just enjoying a temporary winning streak on top of a very fragile system?
It's a deeply provocative thought, but an absolutely essential one for anyone analyzing the true nature of human development.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex, mathematically heavy, but absolutely vital deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers around you, keep looking for the mechanical truths hidden behind the averages, and never assume that the ground beneath you is permanent.